In this episode, we interview Dave Maconi, who is the host of the podcast Brains and Gains.
We had some technical difficulties with this episode on our end, so you won't be seeing us, but you'll be hearing us and you'll be seeing Dave the whole time.
But it's an amazing episode. Tune in and enjoy.
Thanks for coming on our podcast.
Thank you.
Sure.
Just give everyone who doesn't know you, which I know you originally from your podcast Brains and Gains, just give us a brief interview a brief introduction or not brief, whatever you want, of who you are and your background and how you got into nutrition and fitness and all of it.
Sure. So I started when I was actually like 10 years old. I was a fat kid. And then I kind of got some guidance from my dad to lose weight, started losing weight, kind of got the positive feedback, got really into that. Ended up by 14 or so, very, very skinny. At the time, I was like 5'11", 130 pounds. So then I started to bulk up. That's when it really got serious, probably around 14 years old. Read Body for Life, and I was immediately hooked by that. And then since then, it's just been a huge, huge passion of mine. I've spent many, many hours, even per day, reading about it. I remember when I went to college, I told myself I had to set a limit that I could only read 1 or 2 hours of the forums in the morning and 1 or 2 at night. I just had to cap myself because I was just constantly reading about it. Studied exercise science in my undergrad, then went to dental school for a doctor of dental surgery degree, did a residency. And then after the residency, I decided to start a podcast. At that point, I had been lifting for so long, not really going to see as much progress once you're, 10, 15 years into the game. And in the podcast was kind of just a way that I could still be involved, or even more so be involved in the space. And then, as you probably know, every episode I donate to charity. So it's kind of like, well, even if this doesn't do well, at least there's a benefit to it in that sense. But it's done pretty well, and I've made a lot of good connections in the space. So it's been good.
That's awesome.
So can people really have a slow or a fast metabolism?
Yeah, so that's very the common thought, right? I have a fast metabolism, I have a slow metabolism. Everybody can think of somebody who seems to be able to eat so much despite, maybe eating the same as them, or they grew up the same. Like my brother, for instance, he was very lean. Like I said, I grew up as a fat kid, and it seems like he has a really fast metabolism. But if you're thinking of metabolism in terms of basal metabolic rate, that is highly correlated with total body weight and lean body mass. So there are going to be variations in that for sure, but it's not really as much as what people think, like a fast metabolism, like that person is doing nothing else. What ends up actually happening, probably 2 of the biggest factors are your activity, both in terms of the conscious activity that you have and non-exercise activity thermogenesis, NEAT. So that varies hugely among individuals, also varies hugely as far as your response to changes in calories, meaning somebody could decide to drop calories and their NEAT drops dramatically, whereas somebody else decides to drop calories and it barely drops at all. So that's a huge factor, as well as hunger. So hunger is a widely variable, and it's going to depend on the person, and as well as other things that you're doing in life, stress and sleep and all of that. But I think a lot of us who have been focusing on diet for a long time have had the experience that when you're, let's say, bulking up and gaining weight, you might go hours and hours without thinking about food and therefore not really eating, versus when you're really hungry and you're dieting down, it feels like you're not getting to eat anything, even if the actual volume of food might be similar. And so it's very common that you might have the kind of cliche teenager who's very fidgety, right? So they're burning a lot throughout the day. And they think, I just eat whatever I want. I can eat so much. And they think literally, I've had 110-pound girls think that they eat 5,000 calories a day because they think of a single day that they maybe ate an entire pizza, and they don't think that they didn't eat for the next 20 hours, right? And so because they weren't hungry. And likewise, there are people who are predisposed to being heavier who think, I don't really eat that much, but they're not realizing, well, you're snacking here, you're snacking there, and you're snacking here. So all that to say that, again, metabolism definitely varies, but there are other factors that kind of weigh in more.
So in terms of NEAT, is that very genetic based, or is that something that you can control, or how does that factor in?
NEAT by definition is almost something that you can control. I mean, nowadays we talk a lot about step count rather than consciously like, okay, going and doing like 30 minutes of cardio. So that is a way to keep your activity up throughout the day. But typically a lot of people almost by definition say that NEAT is not something that you can control, that it's just when you're, at your desk, you're tapping your foot, you're moving around. There's also evidence now, people talk about the constrained energy model in recent years, and there's some talk about how it's not even, I mean, NEAT is a factor, but actual physiological processes in your body are taking less energy. Your body is, again, conserving the energy by doing things more efficiently. As far as the genetic component, I would imagine like almost everything, there's a large genetic component, but I've not seen studies directly looking at genes related to NEAT.
What actually happens metabolically when somebody goes into a deficit to lose weight? And also like over the longer someone does that, what's happening inside the body metabolically?
So you're referring more to like what the whole idea of metabolic adaptation is?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So the whole, I guess like the story behind metabolic adaptation, at least in our like evidence-based, niche, is kind of funny because a lot of people know that Lane Norton had started talking about it, I don't even know, 10 plus years ago now. And then he got kind of flamed by people like, well, he called it metabolic damage. That was the whole thing, right? And so then people like Lyle McDonald said it's not damage. This is a normal process. I think that gets a little bit into the semantics because it's like, well, if it's an adaptation or it's damage, it's something that we don't want as people who are trying to lose body fat. I think the problem with calling it damage is that, yes, it does seem like it's something that you're harming your body. And a bigger issue is that the claims that this was now leading to long-term issues, that by doing this, you're gonna, you have to spend a year reverse dieting. And I'm glad to see, I think even Lane and people in that camp have gone away from that, because they would talk about adding literally like 5 grams of fat or 5 grams of carbs and 2 grams of fat and just doing it so incredibly slowly. Whereas now I'm glad to see that more people are talking about actually adding a little bit faster. Some people, I think, take it to an extreme and they just go right into like a bulk and they're gaining way too much too quickly. But I think most have realized now that, you can add a few hundred calories per day and get back to your normal metabolic rate and everything within even just a couple of weeks. But yes, it is true that as you diet, the larger your deficit is, the more you will adapt. It's almost never enough to completely stop somebody from being able to lose weight. At some point, a significant calorie deficit is still going to cause weight loss. But those metabolic adaptations that occur, combined with increased hunger, combined with decreased NEAT, and a higher food focus, make it very difficult for some people to get particularly lean.
I've like had times in the past where I've dieted down so aggressively that, and you've probably done this and experienced this before, but you feel like even just getting up to like brush your teeth before bed is too much of too much energy, and you're just like, I can't do it tonight.
Yeah. I mean, one memory I distinctly have is when I was in high school, and this was when I was just like killing myself because I just needed abs and that's what I wanted. And so I was getting up in the morning and doing an hour, 45 minutes maybe of cardio. Then I would go to school. I was eating about 2,000 calories, which, is not horribly low, but for the amount of activity I was doing, because then I would have a 2 or 3 hour swim practice, which would, to only be eating that much after doing all of that. And then I'd come home and I would work out. And it was just a ridiculous amount of activity on very low calories. And I remember then going to play tennis with my family. And my dad is like, are you all right? Like, because I was barely moving, like just to take the step to go towards the ball. It just was like, I can't even do it. So yeah, I think people who have really ramped up ramped up activity and brought calories really low will experience that.
Yeah, definitely.
So how can someone prevent or help mitigate the negative adaptations from occurring during a diet?
Yeah, I mean, if you figure it out, let me know, because I think no, it's tough because there's only so much you can do. So I think it depends if you're looking more from a physiological or psychological aspect. So psychologically, I think one of the hardest things is when you have so much time to focus on the difficulty of the diet. So a lot of people will make the mistake of thinking, well, when I have a ton of time, like I'll do a contest prep when I'm not doing anything else. And many people talk about how that's not a great idea because you're just sitting around. I mean, my hardest diet days would be if I was off from work, for instance, because you're just sitting around thinking like, okay, how much broccoli can I eat to just like bide my time until my next meal or so like my next real meal. When I'm very busy, if I have a 12-hour work day and, I know I have a surgery and then I have a check over here and I almost don't have time to think about it. So I would say staying busy is a really big aspect, and maybe even planning specific activities, whether that's your daily walk, whether that's like if you're involved in sports, something like that, I think really helps mentally. I think from a hunger standpoint, the best way to mitigate that is, well, a few ways. So one, a lot of people now do time restricted feeding, intermittent fasting, pretty much the same thing. And to basically limit your eating window to, some people go as low as 4. I think that's probably less than ideal, but 8 and 16 is very common. So 8 hours of eating, 16 hours of fasting. That tends to help people with hunger. Now, some people, it's not great because they finish their fasting window and then they tend to binge. But a lot of people do have success. And numerous studies now show that you will spontaneously eat less when limiting it to a certain eating window. And it can make you feel like you're still getting, a sufficient quantity of food, both in a specific time period as well as per meal. So if you're eating 2,000 calories and you're dividing that up over 6 meals, that's basically like 6 little snacks, versus if you have it 3 meals in an 8-hour window, you can really feel like you're eating substantial meals. As far as mitigating the physiological adaptations, I would say that is the hardest part, because your body is pretty smart, if you want to use that term, as far as adapting to when there are fewer resources available. And so other than, I mean, you can specifically and consciously add activity. Again, that's where I think step counts have become really popular. I think you can lower your training volume and the stress on your body so that, if you were doing a gaining phase and you're ramping up to the maximum you can recover from, it's almost by definition not going to be possible to do that while dieting. And so that is going to add, if you try to do that, that's going to add to that level of fatigue that we were just talking about. And so if you can cut your training volume to maybe 2/3 of what it was, still maintain your strength for reps and all of that, I think you're probably going to feel better and then have more energy for normal daily activities.
Do you find that diet breaks help? Like, does that help to mitigate any of the adaptations, or is that really just like taking a break psychologically?
I think personally, I think it's both. That's definitely still debated a little bit. So back when I was first getting into this, so that's maybe like 2005, it was a lot about, there were cheat days involved. So even on Body for Life, they talk about once a week, you can just eat whatever you want. Now, I definitely have a more extreme personality in that way. So I was doing, I'd have a 10,000 calorie cheat day, which I certainly don't recommend. I will say that it's kind of shocking at times how much you can get away with in an individual day. I absolutely have lost fat eating 10,000 calories once per week and kind of making up for it in the week. And if you do the math, there's almost no way you should be able to make up for that, right? But it just seems that in one day, whether that's not absorbing everything, obviously from a refeed, you're going to have increased need temporarily, you're going to have decreased hunger, you're going to have a high thermic effect of food and all of that. But again, it's one of those things I don't recommend it. But I noticed that with one day, you can often get away with that. Then people started talking about carb cycling, eating more over, maybe a couple of days was commonly done, maybe like a 5-2. And then in more recent years, there have been some of these diet break studies where you're having a diet break, a 1 week or even 2 weeks. I think psychologically, it's very individual. I think if you've seen some of my podcasts, maybe more last year, there was some debates on the utility of a refeed. So psychologically, it can be great because when you have a refeed or even a diet break, since you specifically asked about diet breaks, to know that, hey, maybe I have to get through this tough 3 weeks, but then I have a whole week off for a lot of people, that improves compliance. And we actually do have some evidence to suggest that. For other people, they find especially a refeed kind of just gets them off the wagon, right? And it's very hard to get back on because they tend to binge. They tend to psychologically, they just want to have their head down, go through the diet, and then be done with it. And that seems to be very individual. Physiologically, we have some evidence that refeeds and diet breaks might help with lean body mass retention. The argument against that is that people will say, well, maybe that's just because calories were then on average higher. And if you could have not had the diet break and just dieted less aggressively. And that is still something that you'll see, there may be like a Menno Henselman's versus like a Renaissance periodization camp versus like a Revive Stronger. I mean, they all have kind of different views on it. Personally, I do like to incorporate some breaks. I don't love to have somebody go 16 weeks with a strong deficit, especially if they're newer to dieting and especially if they're trying to get particularly lean. I think in those cases, it is helpful to break things up.
Yeah, I'm one of those people who do the 10,000 calorie days.
Yeah.
I love fried food and cheese and all that stuff. And recently I've been doing like 48-hour fasts. Where I'll drink like juice and stuff. But then I go ham on the third day.
Yeah.
And it does seem like it doesn't absorb. However, then I am more likely to crave those terrible foods.
Sure.
Which is interesting because then I get like a little taste of it. And now I'm like, okay, I want that for the next week and I'm going to screw this up now.
Are you doing that like throughout, like, is it every 3 days you're doing 2 fasts and a big read, or just once in a while?
It's not really like a regular schedule. It's kind of like when I'm feeling like I need a reset and I'm feeling a lot of bloat, I'll do it like a 2-day and then it's not like a routine. It's
gotcha.
And then it does seem to reset and remove bloat, and I just feel like I'm moving more efficiently, and it worked, but then I binge because I love food. So
yeah. Well, that's one of the biggest downsides with the fasting. So I do a 24-hour fast every week, or at least historically, that's what I've done for a long time. So I finish my meal on Sunday night, and then Mondays are a very long and busy day for me. So again, going back to making it easier to do so. And then Monday night, I'll have my meal. So it's about 24 hours. What I've noticed is that on my drive home, I will be more aware of food, restaurants that I pass by. And I think, man, I would love to have this or that. I force myself not to do that. I get home and then I'll have my regular meal. And usually, like if it's a big meal like that, I might break the fast with a 1,500 calorie meal. So that might be like something big and savory, and then ends up something more sweet. And I'll find that halfway through my savory portion, I'm kind of like, yeah, I'm glad I didn't go on like some bender and have like a ton of food. But the thought is certainly there. And if somebody is not able to control that, then I think that might be a reason not to do the fasting.
I have heard people say like when they get into that third day of fasting, they don't even want to eat anymore, which is interesting. Like I wonder what is actually happening in the brain or hormonally.
Yeah. I've done 2 72-hour fasts, and I would say for the most part, I feel good throughout the whole time. Again, like I had pretty good mental clarity. GI wise, I feel perfect because there's really like nothing going on. I would say you have to be a little careful when you break the fast, because if you go from 3 days of nothing and then you have this high volume, high sodium meal, like that can cause some issues. But yeah, I would say I've wondered if I were to continue to go to 4 or 5 days, if it would continue to be easy, but I've not personally tested that.
In terms of when you work with someone and they've been in a dieting phase for, like a normal length of time, maybe like 16 weeks, 20 weeks or so. And they're at the point where they're like, okay, I'm done. I want to maintain this now. What's your strategy to help them maintain their weight and to find their new maintenance without causing, the weight gain? Because obviously the hardest part of losing weight is keeping it off.
Yeah. So that's obviously going to depend on the person, and it's going to depend on how lean they're trying to maintain. I mean, I have had clients who get very lean and then they say, how do I maintain this? And it's like, you really shouldn't, right? I mean, there is a point that it's just going to be too lean, and your life is going to be less enjoyable overall by doing that. And I mean, also just from a health standpoint, it's just not going to be great. But let's assume that, for a male who wants to maintain pretty lean, like 9 to 11%, that beach lean, and women, you can add a few body fat percentage points, but the equivalent leanness there. First is I do try to diet them a little bit past where they want to maintain, because almost always people will find that if they're trying to maintain the exact same weight at their peak low, it's going to be almost impossible because you have those adaptations that have occurred. But as we mentioned before, those adaptations reverse very quickly. And I'll just give a personal example. So I dieted down to 180 this year, and I made sure no binging afterwards. I just kind of like slowly added calories back. And by the time I was up to even 183, I was eating 800 calories more per day than I was to maintain or to get to 180. So by having a little bit of that buffer, most people find, so that's one of the biggest things, is that you are going to have to accept a couple pounds. And if you find your weight that this is where I'm good, go a little bit below that and give yourself that room. If you're having hunger issues, a lot of the talk is about high volume and basically just filling foods, right? So you're probably not going to, if it's leaner than your natural set point would be or what you're used to being at, then, and there's discussions on if it's a real set point or a settling point, but I think we can hold off on that for now. But essentially, if it's leaner than you're used to being, you might have to get used to eating foods that are, again, more fibrous, just higher volume in general. Some people, very large protein shakes, a lot of like steamed vegetables. And that helps because, that is one of the things, a lot of what we find in fitness that helps with these various diets are ways that you can spontaneously eat less, right? So is it keto? Is it vegan? Is it, whatever diet? Is it, time restricted feeding? Almost all of these in some way focus on getting people to reduce calories without thinking about it. Because if you're constantly having to make the decision every single day, I'm trying to eat less, that is very difficult. Versus if it's just a certain rule, whether that's keto, hey, I'm not going to eat any carbs, whether it's time restricted feeding, I'm not going to eat after this time, that spontaneous reduction is a very good way to go about it. And so for some people, I will implement time restricted feeding. It's actually, I'd say, pretty common for when dieting. But yeah, it's not, there aren't like really too many tricks in my opinion. It's just about developing those patterns over a sustained period of time.
How long does it take on average for your body to adapt in the opposite direction, and be able to maintain your weight on that higher amount of calories? Like, do you have to, because I know in a lot of, you see on Instagram sometimes, like, she was able to maintain her weight on 1,000 extra calories, and but you see how quickly then sometimes they bring up the calories, and then it's like, okay, well, that was 6 weeks, but what happens a year from that point on the same amount of calories? Does the body like slowly gain fat? Like, what happens, what happens with that, and how long someone would have to wait to test it?
Yeah, so I think it happens faster than people used to talk about. Like I said, the whole, I'm glad to see that the industry has gotten away from this idea that you have to very slowly ramp it up. And it's, again, to think that somebody's going to add 2 grams of fat, which I've actually seen recommended, is just insane to me. It's just so impractical, and you're never even going to be that precise with your measurements anyway. But I think, honestly, my experience with clients and what I've seen other people discuss is that it happens within weeks, just, literally like several weeks up to like a month or two. And at that point, it should maintain. I don't think your metabolism will technically increase the higher your calories go, but we're not just looking for what's the maximum we can, obviously it's an equation, right? Calories in versus calories out. So we can have calories out continue to go up and up if we continue to add calories, but the net is going to be more fat gain the higher we go. And so I think there's not anything really magical happening with people, again, this whole building this reserve of calories and building it up. I think you're just undoing those adaptations, and hopefully you're now able to maintain that at a relatively leaner body fat than what you're used to. Now, there's going to be a point where you're not able to continue to go leaner and leaner with that, but many people do find that if they were at once upon a time 20% body fat and comfortably maintaining that, the next cut, now they're kind of able to maintain at 17% and then 15%. And you'll see people who have been doing this for a long time find that they can often maintain relatively lean levels without too much difficulty.
And as a coach, what are your biggest obstacles when it comes to behavior change and making progress?
I would say that's the biggest obstacle as a coach in general, because the reality is even like beginner intermediates kind of know what could cause weight loss. I mean, if I think to when after I had read Body for Life as a 14-year-old, I could have helped the majority of people in the country lose weight, right? I knew the facts to say, hey, if you were to do this, you would lose weight, which is hugely different than knowing, okay, how do I get this person who's had 20 years of bad habits and these expectations that this is going to happen in 6 weeks of working out? How do I get them to stick to something when they think that 2 pounds per week of weight loss is horrible because their first week they lost 8 pounds and then they lost 6 pounds and now they're only losing 1 to 2 per week? How do you get that person to stay motivated? And so that is really, I think, the entire game of being a good coach, because it's not really, yes, you could say, okay, I'm keeping up to date with the research and whatnot. But to be honest, if I had to, either reverse 10 years of my knowledge to as far as working with the psychology of people, or reverse 10 years of my knowledge to reverse like what's the latest nutrition research, I would be better served as a coach to be up to date on the psychological methods and knowing how to talk to somebody. Because while I've learned a ton, obviously, and I'm constantly keeping up with the research as best as possible, that those are smaller details that haven't changed the fact that if somebody wants to lose weight, I have to get them in a calorie deficit over time while maintaining muscle mass, right? And that's nothing new. So that is what I find is very individual, and you have to kind of at times test things out and make sure that the person is understanding and willing to maybe have a trial period, because there's going to be periods where we don't know, are you going to best, and this is why I have a pretty detailed questionnaire of what has worked for you so far, what has not worked for you, because it's really, that's where the individual coaching, and that's as of now, like I don't really tend to write programs for people, or people have asked me for specific diet plans. I don't like to do that because the whole service that I would be providing you is the weekly check-ins and saying, okay, what are we going to do? Remember Rachel, we would talk pretty regularly, right? About what are you weighing today? And then what's going on here. And I think that's important as a coach, especially as one gets leaner and leaner, because that's a big factor.
Even if you know what to do when you're in it yourself, it's hard to make those objective decisions about the best thing to do to move forward, instead of like slashing calories because you want to get them there quicker or whatever it is. So yeah, I found that you do that really well, to just keep people on track in terms of the check-ins and helping with that behavior change.
Well, it's really hard, even for a coach, it's very hard. I've had now for 15 years a training log, and so I have like hundreds of pages of notes and check-ins and weigh-ins and all that. And you'll see that when I'm gaining, it's like, all right, a check-in every 2 weeks, maybe I write a sentence about what's going on. When I'm dieting, it's check-in every week, and I've got paragraphs of like what I think is going on, because you get in your head, you get emotional about what's going on. It's very hard to do that even after all of these years.
Yeah. And especially like, for me, since I've had a past of having an eating disorder, like I find that I can help clients that have had disordered eating or like are on the spectrum of that. But you're right. Like when you're trying to coach yourself, it's really hard it would be hard for me to be objective and be like, okay, well, this week I've gained a pound because I'm on my period or whatever. Like, well, I think I have to drop calories because I'm not losing weight fast enough and my body looks big. And like, when really it's just my brain playing tricks on me, and it's old habits of, disordered eating thoughts, like getting at me. So
For sure. Yep.
It's funny. I find myself lying to myself after I've binged, and I'll be like, yeah, I ate that whole wheel of cheese, but I'm not gonna, like, it's not gonna show on me. Like, it's so weird. Like I play games with myself where I know logically that this is ruining me right now.
Yeah.
But then I just want more of it because those types of foods are so addictive and you just want more. And you're like, I'll break out the other wheel too. And like, you know what? I screwed it up today. I might as well just keep going. It won't show too much. And it's just great. Like I hear these lies and I believe them. And then, I wake up the next day and realize that.
Yeah. It's tough with those foods. I mean, they're extremely palatable, right? I mean, they're basically designed that way, and it's hard. And that's honestly like one of the things for me, like some people, and again, it's so individual, but some people, like I think of like my mom, like she's always been, well, she just doesn't understand the idea of a binge because she just doesn't have a big appetite. She'll say she loves chocolate or she loves this, but she's literally okay with having like a bite of chocolate or like a half a piece of pizza. And like, to me, I just am the type of person that's like, if I'm going to have a piece, if I'm going to have pizza, it's going to be 3 or 4 pieces. And if I'm not going to have that, I would rather just not eat it. And it's not it's not a disordered eating. It's just knowing I just genuinely would not enjoy it enough unless I'm going to have more of it. So most of my days are going to just be my healthy calories. And it's not, I don't want half a donut. I don't want a little bit of this. Like when I'll have those. Now, again, you have to be careful to not say, well, when I'm going to have some junk food, I'm going to eat 10,000 calories. But I do think it's reasonable to say that when you're going to have something that's, more in the junk food category, that you can have it, enjoy it, but be able to get back to your normal diet. And if you can't, it's important to know that about yourself.
Yeah, definitely. That gets into the whole, idea of moderator versus abstainer, which like for me, I can't have peanut butter in the house because that's like a common one for us in the fitness industry, because it's like, an actual serving of peanut butter is like the measured out and like leveled out tablespoon, whereas like
right.
You'll see the memes of people like scooping a huge heaping tablespoon.
Yeah.
This is my 1 tablespoon, and you're eating like 500 calories.
This is my tablespoon. I've seen that before, the tablespoon, and it's technically in the spoon.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that's a really important thing, and also something to remember as a coach, because again, I've been doing this since I was 10 years old. So sometimes I will have to step back and realize that like things that I've been doing, like it was literally a joke. So like my sister's 5 years younger than me. And so her friends would like joke about how I, in high school would measure things. Like they'd always see me with like tablespoons, like, oh, like measuring out the tablespoon of peanut butter or whatever else I was using. And it's almost weird for me not to do that. Like it's so normal for me now. Or if I'll like put something on a scale, right? I'll tear it to 0 and then I'll take whatever amount out that I need. And okay, there's the weight. So sometimes I have to remind myself, well, okay, this person is saying that this is what their diet is, but is it actually? Do they even know yet at a beginner level that a tablespoon is not literally taking a spoon and just taking out an amount, right? Because as you said, that could be hundreds of calories. Or a cup of oatmeal actually needs to be measured, or like that's the dry weight versus the cooked weight and everything like that. So those are all things that, at I think my level and a lot of people's level, like in our evidence-based industry, we think, oh, everybody kind of knows these things. And the reality is the general population does not know these things, right? And it's important to remember that.
Getting back to the adaptations, can you explain the differences between someone with a very adaptive metabolism versus someone with a very non-adaptive metabolism?
So basically the idea behind that is, and again, you have to consider, is it metabolism or is it NEAT? And what you find is that it often happens in both directions. So, you might think that somebody is, they're going to drop calories and nothing's going to happen. But then when they gain, it's going to be like, they're going to, be able to adapt a lot. You often see people who in one direction or the other, just nothing really happens, but you do find those people. So for instance, somebody who's predisposed to being heavier at like, in a worst case scenario, they might be somebody who adds calories. And actually, I do remember seeing one subject in one study where their NEAT actually went down upon adding calories, right? Which is just like a double whammy. And it's really unfortunate. Now, again, I don't know if that was replicated, but I have seen that. Whereas somebody who's very adaptable, I think in that same study, I believe it was that they added 1,000 calories and the person's NEAT made up for like 800 or 900 calories of that, where it almost had no effect. And those are the people who you would say this person has a very fast metabolism. And almost certainly their metabolism did increase if you actually looked at their basal metabolic rate. But a huge part of that is how they are adapting to that. And conversely, somebody who, and you'll see this with on the other way with dieting, like I tend to have a very adaptable metabolism when I drop calories. So right now I can maintain 185 on 3,100 calories. But if I really want to get down to even 180, I'm probably looking at about 2,000 calories per day, right? And some people like Steve Hall from Revive Stronger, he'll get contest lean on like 2,600 calories, which is crazy to me. And he does get a lot of steps. There's a difference there in activity. He'll work out 5 days a week. He'll get 15,000 steps. Whereas at the time I was working out 3 days a week and getting, 5,000 or 6,000 steps a day. So again, there are other factors, but yeah, essentially it's just how much your body is going to adapt from all of those factors that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, I remember that in one of your podcast episodes, you were talking about how, and you may have told me this separately, I don't remember, but you were talking about how you were on like 1,000 calories at one point.
So that was more of just an experimentation just to see what would happen. I was getting to my leanest ever. And every time I talk about the experiment, I make it very clear to say, I do not recommend this. Don't do this. It was just to see. And so I did 2 weeks at 1,000 calories, which was miserable. And it was worse, I think, than fasting, because with fasting, when you have no food, it really does seem like something is happening that your body just kind of shuts down the hunger mechanisms after a while, not completely, but to a significant extent. When you're always getting like just enough calories, 1,000 calories for 2 weeks, the whole time I was just incredibly hungry. But shockingly, well, if you know me and how my body adapts to calorie deficits, it's not that shocking. I actually gained weight during that period, which, to be very, very clear, in no way means that I gained fat. I absolutely lost fat during that period, but I had such a stress response to it that I gained about 2 pounds, 2 to 3 pounds in that period. And obviously that's a lot of water. And once I went back to normal calories, there was that kind of whoosh effect and I did lose the weight. So I just want to be very clear that, like, yes, it sounds crazy. 2 weeks at 1,000 calories, I gained weight, but don't mistake that. It's just how my body adapted to it. It was just kind of an experiment.
What is set point theory, and is there merit to that?
Yeah, so we kind of touched on that earlier, set point versus settling point. So it's always like body fat set point. This is where you're kind of destined to be. And then more so, it's then people talk about a settling point where you're kind of most comfortable. And in general, that is, I think, clearly true to an extent, right? It's very obvious that when you look at certain people, they tend to be skinnier throughout their life. They tend to be heavier throughout their life. But there are so many factors that play into that. So one is going to be your muscle mass. So the more muscle mass you have, the more calories you're going to burn. I think of how, when I say I was a fat kid, that wasn't like I was consciously trying to eat so much more than like my brother or anything like that. But that's just what felt natural to me. And now I can maintain, 12% body fat without too much effort. And why is that? And so one is, well, obviously, going through puberty and just like, aging. But then two is developing patterns of eating. So again, like a time restricted feeding, focusing on healthier foods. And so when we talk about settling points, we have to kind of consider, are we just talking about where your body, quote, wants to be, or is it also the habits? And I would say that settling point is in part going to be determined by what kind of foods you're eating. If I told you that you could eat as much processed food and junk food and whatever as you wanted, almost certainly whatever your settling point is, would end up being would be higher than if I said, focus on let's just say a Mediterranean diet. So I would say there is definitely merit to it. And some people are just never going to be able to be, let's say, sub 10% body fat, regardless of how much fiber they're eating and how small their eating window is. It's going to affect their psychology and their physiology in negative ways. But I do think you can, for the average person or anybody in that, kind of like the middle of the bell curve there, you can maintain a pretty lean physique with, again, some of these methods we've talked about.
It makes sense that it's much easier to increase your set or settling point than to increase it.
Yeah, I mean, once the fat cells, the adipocytes are created in your body, there's really no way to get rid of them short of liposuction. With that said, I mean, I do think that again, there's no studies to my knowledge on this, but anecdotally, it really does seem that you can kind of change that settling point. And even for me, like when I've had periods of time where I was eating more junk food, I'm still maintaining way leaner than when I was young. But certainly, yeah, somebody who has spent a long time getting quite heavy and gaining a lot of body fat, I wouldn't be surprised to find that that person is then a little bit more predisposed to being heavier.
Are there
Yeah.
any actual nutraceutical or supplements out there that you would say can, are proven or at least show in the literature that can help a bit with fat loss?
Not a lot. Like you said, I mean, there's certainly some pharmaceuticals that can help a lot. And I guess it also depends on, by help with fat loss, are we talking about through an increased metabolism, or would blunting hunger count? Because if we're including blunting hunger, then yeah, I mean, Dr. Nadolsky has talked about some of these newer pharmaceuticals that really help blunt hunger. And if anything, going back to what, the start of the conversation, hunger is such a massive aspect here as to who is successful with weight loss, that if you could take an obese population and significantly blunt their hunger, I mean, that's going to have dramatic effects. But I'm sure the bodybuilding community will also use those drugs to help them get extremely lean. So again, that's still in the pharmacy category, but that's just something to look out for, I think, more in the future. But if you count fiber as a supplement, then that will also help. There are fiber supplements, so that can help with hunger for sure. Caffeine has been shown to help with fat loss. Again, we're not talking anything super dramatic, but some people find that caffeine will blunt hunger. It will probably increase metabolism and probably increase your NEAT and whatnot to some degree. And then other than that, I don't personally, I mean, I know some people will talk about other ones. I don't get too much into the supplement side. I mean, there are certain things I recommend for gaining versus dieting. Although again, generally I have like, okay, here's these core health supplements I recommend. Here's a few that can help with muscle retention. You could argue, well, muscle retention is then indirectly going to help with the fat loss, right? But it's not something that I put much weight on at all. I say, you could have 200 to 400 milligrams of caffeine a day. Some people, the green tea extract was kind of big for a while. I think there's some evidence that can help a little bit, but I really don't hype it up too much.
Can people build muscle and lose fat simultaneously? God,
Yes.
I swear
You
to
can
God.
efficaciously build it simultaneously.
Yeah, efficaciously, simultaneously.
Yeah. So I had a good discussion with Menno on the podcast about this. And so essentially, it's definitely possible. It is increasingly more difficult the more advanced somebody gets and the leaner somebody gets. So if you are untrained and you're a 25% body fat male, never been in the gym, you can, I wouldn't say easily, but very predictably lose fat and gain muscle at the same time. Yeah, I mean, or really, you put that person in a 500-calorie deficit, you get them in the gym, it's almost guaranteed to happen, and that's typically what we see. If you've got somebody who's an intermediate, who's been lifting for 5 years, let's say again, a male, 16% body fat, can they do it? Yes. Is it worth it at that point? I personally am more of a fan of having distinct phases. So I'm going to have you in a gaining phase, then we're going to have you in a dieting phase. Could we hope for a little bit of muscle gain during that period? Yes, but certainly at a much, much slower rate. And then we have to weigh does it make sense to then try to have such a small deficit when we could have you in a larger deficit, not gain any muscle, but quickly lose the fat and then have you back in a gaining phase faster. That's generally how I go about it. But some people do. And, depending on the person's, again, psychology, we might want to take it slower, in which case, yes, if you program things correctly, you could still gain a little bit of muscle while losing fat. At an advanced level, the only times you're going to see it typically to any measurable degree are if you've had a layoff. So maybe you have been lifting for 15 years, but you took a month off for whatever reason, you got injured, you were 2 months out of the gym. When you come back, you could predictably see a recomp effect because you've just lost the muscle. And so regaining muscle is fairly easy compared to building it in the first place. And then, of course, obviously, if you go the enhanced route and, use steroids, then again, pretty predictably, you could be in a calorie deficit while still gaining muscle.
Where can people find you? Are you doing, I know you said that you just opened up your dental practice, which congratulations.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So yeah, where can people find you? Are you doing coaching right now and all of that?
Yeah, so I still do coaching, not as much as I used to. At this point, I mean, I've really never talked too much about or advertised the coaching, but people do email me or DM me. I would just say, if you're interested, feel free to reach out through either of those areas, and I'll let you know if I'm still taking people on. And most of my stuff is on Instagram. That's just Dave_Maconi, and then the YouTube channel is Brains and Gains Podcast.
Okay, awesome.
All right, awesome. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, happy to be.